Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Workforce Rewired. I am so excited that today's guest is John Oxford, the president and CEO of L&M Companies. And our topic is hiring for potential versus experience, something that I know a lot of our HR professionals grapple with and leaders and managers in organizations. So, John, thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you this morning.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, John, our topic, potential versus experience. Let's start out with kind of a projection question. And that is, if you had to hire for one role tomorrow and you had a candidate with 10 years of experience, and on the other hand, you had a brilliant newcomer with zero experience, where do you go? Which one do you pick? And what's the first thing that makes you hesitate?
That's a great question, Cheryl. And first off, let me admit that I enjoy the process of helping people grow and develop both professionally and personally. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction. But that often comes with people that have less experience rather than more. So that's a bias that I sometimes have to just keep in check. But let me answer the question this way. If I had to choose tomorrow, I would have to say it depends. It depends on the role. If it's a role where the business is fragile or where it needs more fuel, that's going to kind of lead me down one path or the other. Our company operates in the fresh produce space, and if a role touches food safety or regulatory compliance or customer trust or things like that, I'd lean heavily towards experience. You don't experiment in our business where the margin for error is very small. But if the role is about growth and innovation or building new capability, let's say data analytics, supply chain optimization, or business development or things like that, I would say I'd probably be more open to hiring or choosing the brilliant newcomer. The hesitation is a little different for each. With experience, I worry about pattern lock. Has the person been successful in one environment and mistaken that for a belief that they can apply the same principles regardless of the situation? And with newcomers, I would say I worry about time. Do we truly have the leadership bandwidth to work with and help develop that person? So
Yeah.
again, it depends. And that's
That's a good lawyer answer. Nat. Well, I think a lot of our new graduates would appreciate your answer of it depends, because oftentimes I hear from the new college graduates coming out that they can't gain experience, and some might say that experience is just potential that's wrapped up that somebody else has paid for. And so do you agree with that? Do you think that there's, kind of a way that that falls apart where experience isn't just what somebody else has paid for?
uh, I think I would say broadly, yes, I agree with that sentiment. But I'd say it falls apart where in roles where judgment is forged through consequence. Experience matters most when decisions are irreversible or the stakes are really high. And in produce, again, in the fresh produce space, like as we operate in, there are moments. There are things like food safety recalls or supplier failures or major customer escalations where you want someone who has felt the weight of having made a wrong decision in the past. And sometimes it's hard to simulate that type of earned caution and credibility. That said, in many higher level roles, experience can often be a shorthand for comfort. And
Mhm.
comfort is not the same as capability. So potential becomes dangerous only when we don't acknowledge where experience is genuinely foundational.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And you mentioned it in your opening statement that you love to develop individuals. And so I'm curious how you go about spotting high potential in an interview. Is there a question or an exercise or a way that you get at that answer and you know it when you see it?
I'm not perfect at this, I'll say, but I try to look less at what someone knows and more how they think, how they reason, how they work under pressure. One question I try to use consistently is, tell me about a time when something you were confident in turned out to be wrong, and what changed your mind? Uh, for me, the higher potential candidates, the ones that answer, or the folks that will answer the question along these lines, they don't try to defend themselves and not admit a mistake. They have some humility. They reflect. They talk about signals they missed, assumptions they challenged, and how their thinking evolved. Um, as I said, the best answers to that question for me show a little bit of humility, curiosity, and how quickly they learned. Someone told me a long time ago that the only mistake is to not learn from your mistakes.
Mm.
So if we learn, then it's not a mistake. It happened, we move forward, and so forth. So, but for me, back to the question, I'm looking for, are people learning? Are they growing? Are they developing? And the red flag for me is absolute certainty without self-questioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And the example you gave is, such a nice one of kind of creating a behavioral based interview process where you can get at more than just scripted questions and you can get into the mind of somebody to see how they think and how they process new information. I'm curious. This isn't one of the questions I originally planned to ask you, John, but I'm curious in the age of AI now, do you find that your questions are changing based on the candidates there, or is that not a factor in, particularly in the produce industry?
It is changing the dynamic of the interview process for sure. AI is. I would not say we've mastered it at this point, but figuring out how to apply and leverage AI in our space is something that is still pretty nascent, but we are looking at it as an organization and as an industry and finding new and better ways to apply it. In the interview context, I guess I would say I want to know how people are using it, what success they've had with it, what challenges or problems they've encountered with the use of AI, and hopefully, learn something myself personally, but also think about how we can apply things that we're not currently doing in the business.
Yeah, yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays itself out in the next couple of years. But thank you for letting me divert. I'll come back to kind of the spectrum of potential versus experience. And I guess I'd ask your perspective on, are there hidden costs or risks that companies face if they always default to experienced hires versus always betting on potential? Do you see hidden costs in leaning too far one way or the other?
Sure do. I would say the hidden cost of defaulting to experience is the potential for organizational stagnation.
Mhm.
You slowly optimize for the past. You also send a signal, especially to the younger talent that you might have in your business, that growth opportunities don't exist unless you leave. And that's not what we're looking for. On the other side, the hidden cost of over indexing on potential is something I would call maybe leadership debt. And what I mean by that is hiring for potential requires structure, it requires feedback and sponsorship and time and effort and resources and bandwidth on the part of leadership. Um, that said, if you don't invest deliberately, the new hire burns out. They can underperform, disengage, and oftentimes, which I think is a tragedy, the organization blames that individual rather than the system or the way things were set up, and that's a real problem that I see from time to time.
Yeah, I think that's a great nugget of insight for us that, it's one thing to say that you support development of individuals, and we know statistics show that The early career professionals thrive in organizations where they get professional development, but there's a cost to that, and that cost is time, and the tenacity of the managers to develop them. So I'm really glad you brought up that point. Um, so you mentioned earlier that there's some roles that you will just hire on experience. Things like food safety, where you just can't have risk. And I think of other professions like surgeons and pilots or CFOs. Where some might say experience is a non-negotiable. And so your world, you certainly have regulatory risks. Do you think there are other professions where they're using that safety as a cover because they're risk adverse?
I think, yes, it's probably both. For us, I would say experience is non-negotiable, where a failure could create harm, be it physical, I mentioned before that on the food safety side, financial or reputational,
Mhm.
and when the recovery options for those failures are limited. If you take the example of, say, the position of a CFO, you can have a high potential finance leader, but at some point you need someone who's had the experience of living through those economic cycles and the audits and the big capital investment decisions that need to be made. Sometimes I think we fool ourselves, though, in assuming that years served equals readiness.
Mhm.
The real requirement isn't tenure, it's tested judgment. And sometimes I think it's fair to say, though, that that can come faster than you expect. It's just really trying to figure out how do you identify that in the process.
Interesting. Yeah. And then on the potential side, let me go back to the earlier question. You mentioned, having the time and resources to invest. How is L&M structured to develop someone when you hire for potential?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that we're perfect at this. I'll just say that right up front. We are always working and striving to be better, but understanding the concept that when you're hiring for potential, you need to make sure you got the organization aligned, because if you're not planning on all the effort and the work that it's going to take to develop that person, then that's tantamount to some level of mismanagement, if you will. We've learned several things over the years, sometimes through the school of hard knocks, if you will. But first off, I would say we've learned when it comes to hiring, folks with potential, that you've got to be very intentional in setting the expectations right up front. You got to have absolute clarity on the role, on the success metrics, on things like decision authority, and expectations and so forth along those lines. Secondly, you need to make sure you give the person the opportunity to really kind of get away from the edge of the pool, so to speak. You don't learn to swim just by hanging onto the edge of the pool. You got to get away from the edge. So people need to find opportunities, and we need to let them get out there and own the outcomes, and with appropriate guardrails, but make sure that they get a chance to kind of do things on their own. And then this is probably just as important as setting the expectations is giving feedback and coaching where appropriate. Again, nobody's perfect. It's not always going to be perfect, but when I think about it, it's our responsibility as leaders in any situation. It doesn't matter whether they're a brilliant newcomer or someone that's long tenured and got tons of experience. It's our obligation to give that feedback on things that are going well and on things that perhaps need to be changed or be different. And that's a pretty big commitment. It's a heavy lift, and particularly, excuse me, when you're talking about bringing in someone that's got a lot of potential but maybe doesn't have the experience. And as I talked about before, where the system or the organization fails, unfortunately, it doesn't work out well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you said, we learn the most from our failures. So giving them that opportunity to get away from the wall, as you described, helps you learn. Tell me, maybe I'll turn this to you and say, tell us a time when maybe you got it wrong. You went with experience when you needed energy, or maybe you bet on potential and it didn't, land the way you thought. What did you learn from that?
Another great question. Just so I don't incriminate myself or anybody that someone in our organization might know, I'm going to relate an experience from years ago. It was when I hired someone to be a financial analyst for a business that I was fairly new to. So I was learning the business, and I knew what I needed from the financial analytics perspective because I had done it myself before and I'd worked with other people that were really good at it. But I hired someone thinking that I could spend a lot of time with them to help them get up the learning curve and invest that time in them. The person was right out of college with very little work experience, certainly in none in our industry and very little as a financial analyst. I will honestly say I completely underestimated the time and the effort it would take to get this person up to speed. And I completely overestimated the time that I or others in the company could make available to work with this person to help them learn the business, the role, the expectations, and so forth. There's no doubt the person had potential and they had the skills, but they lacked the basic knowledge that would have made a huge difference in their ability to accomplish what needed to be done right there and right then. So, as much as I would love to say that this story had a great ending, unfortunately, it didn't end as a success story, not from my perspective, but I did own it. It was my fault and not the fault of the new hire. And what I learned from it is that you need to be very intentional and pragmatic about the needs you have at that point in time and realistic about the bandwidth the organization has available to dedicate to that learning process. So, as I said before, it's not a mistake if you learn from it. So I've learned a lot um, and have tried to put those learnings into practice with new potential hires that I personally have brought in to the organization and encouraged other people to learn from my failings also when they bring in the brilliant newcomers.
What a great model of humility yourself, John, in that story. All right, I got time for one last question for you, and that is if you could give every hiring manager just one concrete thing to change about how they evaluate candidates, what would it be?
I would have to say it would be to stop asking, can this person do the job? And instead start asking, what kind of version of themselves will this role force them to become? And can we support it?
Mm,
I learned a long time ago that if we treat people as they are, we make them worse. But if we treat people as they ought to be, we can help them become what they're capable of becoming. And I think that shift in that mindset, stop asking what, can the person do the job and start asking, what kind of version of themselves will this role force them to become? I think that changes everything. It moves um, hiring from risk avoidance to responsible growth. And it makes leaders accountable, not just for the hire, but for the outcome.
yeah. Wow. Great words to live by. John Oxford, President and CEO of L&M Companies, has been my guest today on Workforce Rewired, talking about hiring for potential versus experience. John, I really appreciate your words of wisdom today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.